On this first segment of Ask the Pastor, your question from last week was, why do Matthew and Luke evoke the Old Testament like they do? Why do they prioritize the Old Testament prophecies? It's a good question. It's actually a strange question for Matthew and for Luke and for the New Testament writers, because they did not see any disconnect between Old Testament and New Testament. In fact, there is nothing old about the story of God's salvation. For them, there is but one story that continues from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all the way to the birth of Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the experience in the early church. It's a one continuing story. But in Christian theology, early on, during the age of the church fathers, so the end of the first century into the second and third, a theology arose called supersessionism, or replacement theology. And basically, it goes like this. Promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promises that the prophets spoke about, the promises that were brought up to the time of Jesus' life. When the Jewish people rejected Jesus and his ministry, all those promises were thrown out the window. All those promises made back then did not carry forward beyond Jesus. Only through belief in Jesus were the promises of the past carried into the life of believers in the present. As you can imagine, this theology was problematic. It was problematic in the fact that it helped undergird an anti-Semitism. As the Christians persecuted their parents in the faith, the Jewish people, they looked back in this supersessionism as kind of a theological justification for it. It was okay to persecute the Jews because they rejected and the promises no longer applied to them. It wasn't until after the Holocaust in the last century that mainline Christian theologians said, this is problematic. It's problematic for a variety of reasons. One of which is, if God makes his promises and then changes a mind later, what does that say about God's promises? And is that really the God of steadfast love of which the Scripture speaks? Instead of supersessionism, replacement theology, many churches, including the ELCA, adopted what is known as a dual covenant. And this idea goes like this. The promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those are lasting. The promises made to us through Jesus Christ, those are lasting. Since God is a God of promises, both those promises continue side by side. Both of those promises continue. In the 1994 Statement of Apology from the ELCA to the Jewish people related to the Holocaust, it was recognized in that statement that the people of God, the Jewish people, remain part of God's plan and salvation. The Jewish people remain a part of the covenant because God remembers the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as Christians, we have access to those promises through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but that experience with Jesus does not invalidate the other promises. What do you think? Is God a promise maker and keeper? Or does God change his mind? And if so, what do you make of, in the Old Testament, God constantly, again, returning and returning, forgiving the people? And in the New Testament, what do you make of the act of forgiveness that Jesus demonstrates in his ministry and constantly is sharing with his disciples? The notion that God forgives us and loves us and reconnects. God desires communion with us. For God is everlasting and God's love is steadfast. That's my question. That's the answer for this week. I hope you have a chance to think about that, discuss it some more. And as you're reading through this week's chapter, Matthew chapter 1, what questions pop out for you? Be sure to write them down, send them to me, and next week they might be a part of this segment of Ask the Pastor. Thanks.